In the Reagan White House, I had a special job. I was the well man. A speech would be written for the president. It would go to President Reagan. He would put in his final comments, and then it would come back to me. And here and there in the speech, I would insert, well, you just made a point. You laughed. I told that same joke, fool that I am, to a group of Stanford students just last week, and I got no reaction. And I thought to myself, oh my goodness, these are 20-year-old kids. They have no memory of Ronald Reagan or the Cold War whatsoever. Zero. We have reached the point at which preserving the testimony of what happened is imperative. And so I thank, as we all thank, the victims of Communism Commission for their magnificent work in this regard. The title of this panel is Soviet Imperialism, the Captive Nations, and Global Revolution. My fellow panelists are gentlemen of such eminence that if I started to go into detailed introductions, we'd be here until midnight. So let me just perform brief introductions. Jeremy Friedman, immediately to my right, directed the Grand Strategy program at Yale before taking up his current position as an assistant professor at Harvard Business School. He received his doctorate in history from Princeton. His first book was Shadow Cold War, the Sino-Soviet Competition for the Third World. He's now working on a volume entitled Ripe for Revolution, Building Socialism in the Third World. John Earl Haynes. In this crowd, well, I'll go ahead and do the introduction. I'm just thinking that really there are people who don't need introductions in this crowd, and John is one of them, but here we go. John earned his doctorate at the University of Minnesota and served as the 20th century political historian at the Library of Congress from 1987 until his retirement 5 years ago. He's the author or co-author of a dozen books, including classic works, truly classic works. This man's work has transformed people's understanding of the Cold War. The classic works Spies, The Rise and Fall of the KGB in America, and Venona, Decoding Soviet Espionage in America. Mark Kramer, continuing down the line, serves as the Director of Cold War Studies at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. He trained in mathematics at Stanford. Bear that in mind when you ask him questions. Logic. Then found himself drawn to international studies as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford. Dr. Kramer is the author of many books and articles, and he served as editor and translator of the classic work, again a work that transformed people's understanding, The Black Book of Communism. Dr. Kramer is now editing a 3-volume collection, The Fate of Communist Regimes, 1989 to 1991. Emanuelis Zingeris graduated from the University of Vilnius, taught at the university, and joined the pro-democratic movement, which I am about to mispronounce, Sąjūdis. Sąjūdis. I got your name right, though.
Yes, sir.
Oh. That looks like a close enough rather than a spot on. In 1990, he was a signatory to the act that reestablished Lithuania as an independent nation, and he has remained a prominent member of the Lithuanian parliament ever since. To frame our discussion very briefly, I'd like to note that the title of this panel, 3 nouns and 3 adjectives, Soviet Imperialism, the Captive Nations, and Global Revolution, in that straightforward title are lurking 3 provocative questions. Was the Soviet Union really an empire, or just a great power behaving the way great powers behave? Were the captive nations really captive, or simply forced to put up with the kind of hegemony that small nations on the border of a large nation would be expected to face? And did the Soviets really intend global revolution, or did they simply seek spheres of influence behind which to defend themselves? 100 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, and more than a quarter of a century after the fall of the Soviet Union, It's my hope that we might actually get to answers to these questions, but I'd like very briefly to tell you a story that demonstrates how live those questions remained even in the final phases of the Cold War. In 1987, as Paula Dobriansky mentioned, I was given the assignment to write a speech that Ronald Reagan would deliver at the Berlin Wall, and in which he used the phrase, "Mr. Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek liberalization, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now, what I think is striking, interesting, I hope it's interesting all these years later, is how bitterly that speech was opposed inside the Reagan White House. The State Department, the National Security Council, the diplomat on the ground in Berlin, all fought the speech. May I have slide number 1, please? You may not be able to see this well, but this is a markup of an early draft, and this is the markup from the National Security Council. You can see that they've lined out at the bottom, tear down this wall, big X through that. Out! May I have slide number 2? So a battle went on over this speech for about 3 weeks, and here is a memorandum from Peter Rodman, a good guy, to Colin Powell, then number 2 at the National Security Council, and which the Brandenburg speech is better than it was before. I had made some concessions to the NSC, but the staff is still unanimous that it's a mediocre speech and a missed opportunity. Close quote. Thank you for that slide. But to anticipate, just these gentlemen need to do the talking, but my own view was that of Ronald Reagan's, that there were answers to those questions even then. And I will tell you the way all of this ended was the Deputy Chief of Staff, Ken Duberstein, sat the president down a couple of days before he was to deliver the speech and went over the objections with him from the State Department and the National Security Council. And Ken told me, I wasn't present, but Ken told me that they went back and forth discussing it for a few moments. And then Ronald Reagan got a twinkle in his eye, characteristic if you knew him and worked around him. And he said, now, I'm the president, aren't I? Yes, Mr. President, Ken replied, we are clear about that much. So I get to decide if that line stays in? Yes, sir, it is your decision. Well then, it stays in. And now we turn to the eminent panelists. Jeremy.
That's quite a hard act to follow. First, I want to thank the Victims of Communism Foundation for inviting me. I was told that I was supposed to submit my comments in advance. So I apologize for the first time since my bar mitzvah. I will be reading my talk. So global communism, world revolution, proletarian internationalism. For some people, these are terms conjured by fevered McCarthyite imaginations, or worse, cynical tools employed in the name of rapacious American capitalism and imperialism. For others, they are idealistic glosses on a nefarious, centralized conspiracy directed towards world domination by the Kremlin. For the first group, communists in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the regions that made up what was often called the Third World during the Cold War, were above all nationalists, fighting for the interests of their people for independence, national dignity, economic development, and social progress. Their vocal adherence to communism was a reflection of either their idealism or simply a product of the fact that the Western powers that opposed communism also seemed to oppose the independence and progress of third world states. At times, it reflected the willingness of the Soviets, Chinese, and others to provide aid to their struggles for freedom. When people such as Ho Chi Minh, Fidel Castro, or Mengistu Haile Mariam enacted policies reminiscent of Stalinist Russia or Maoist China, some in this first group expressed shock and surprise, and others continued to assert that these leaders were truly motivated by the best interests of their people. Claims that these figures were somehow tied to international conspiracy was either a tragic mistake, leading the United States to undertake costly crusades that were doomed to failure, or a cynical ploy on the part of the military-industrial complex to sell its wares. For the second group, the activities of communists around the world were coordinated from Moscow in a way that differed little from the earliest days of the Comintern. Soviet officials picked locations for revolutionary disruptions that would deprive the West of key raw materials or provide specific strategic advantages. Soviet aid to Angola was an attempt to put a Soviet naval presence astride the routes of oil tankers from the Persian Gulf to Western Europe when the Suez Canal was closed. I've seen these analyses. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was the first step towards a Soviet takeover of the Gulf itself. In this model, revolution was exported by Moscow, Beijing, Havana, and sometimes others as part of a concerted plan for world domination, and local communists were either dupes or cynical subcontractors. Revolutionary disruptions, then, were less the product of local circumstances than they were manifestations of a new type of imperialist expansion, one made all the more dangerous by clothing itself in the language of justice. So in order to understand the threat that communism represented, it is important that we gain a proper understanding of the relations between communists around the world during the Cold War. Fortunately, the opening of archives and publishing of memoirs allows us windows into these relationships that would have been unimaginable during the Cold War. The issue of the relationships between communist parties was central to their legitimacy. Opponents, both domestic and foreign, often attacked communists as agents of a foreign power who put the interests of international communism, or the Kremlin, above those of their compatriots, or the working masses they claimed to represent. Communists often countered by claiming that they were nationalists, authentic representatives of the people. Moreover, they were often the truest advocates because of their opposition to foreign imperialism, at times bolstered by the prominent role that communists had often played in anti-colonial struggles. They claimed that their policy choices were their own, and that their sources of support and funding were domestic. The truth, however, lies somewhere in between. Despite the disbanding of the Comintern in 1943 and the Cominform in 1956, communist parties around the world remained in very close contact. The International Department of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union took over many of the activities and responsibilities of the Comintern. These included regular consultations, dispensing advice and direction, ideological instruction, and the provision of textbooks, propaganda materials, printing presses, cash, and much more. Contact was much more frequent than many observers understood at the time. For example, the Indonesian Communist Party, the world's third largest communist party in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and a popular object of study among Western scholars, claimed to be charting its own unique path based on Indonesian conditions and national interests. This claim was bolstered by Western scholars who relied on interviews with Indonesian communist leaders and published documents. The truth was more complicated. Indonesia's strategy for taking power through peaceful means was actually crafted with significant guidance from the Chinese and from Joseph Stalin himself between 1950 and 1952. Indonesian communist leaders remained in nearly constant contact with the Soviets and Chinese through both embassy and international department contacts, and factions within the leadership of the Indonesian Communist Party used contacts with Moscow and/or Beijing for leverage and internecine struggles. This is not to say the Indonesian Communist Party, one of the loudest voices in the communist movement for the independence of individual parties, was simply a tool of outside powers. Rather demonstrates that the relationships between communist parties during the Cold War was something like a franchise relationship. Moscow felt itself in a position to decide who would and would not be allowed to lead the local franchise of international communism, and it enforced this through attempts to control individual leaders and policy positions. The nature of this relationship became clearest in the limit cases, such as Indonesia, where a communist party that was powerful enough to seek independence nevertheless found itself constantly having to explain, justify, and protect itself from its ostensible benefactor, often by calling on the support of the Chinese. Unlike business franchises, however, money tended to flow from the headquarters to the local franchisers rather than the other way around. Funding of communist parties was a central issue in the discussions of whether communist parties were really nationalist or not. Despite claims that funding sources were all domestic, we now know that funding communist parties abroad was a regular function of the Soviet Communist Party. In fact, there was something like a regular appropriations process, which is very fitting here on Capitol Hill, in which funds were allocated to parties and movements in good standing with Moscow. Anyone who wanted an increase in funding would request from the International Department, and the International Department would amalgamate these requests into an annual budgetary proposal for foreign communist funding. Delivery of the money often required a greater deal of creativity, but the appropriations process seems remarkably routine. While the ties between communist parties during the Cold War were more robust than many at the time imagined, this does not mean that international communism functioned according to a plan drawn up by the Kremlin. Contrary to visions of Soviet strategists plotting revolutions on a map, Soviet leaders found themselves responding to events rather than creating them most of the time. Places like Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, and Vietnam were not locations chosen to expose the vulnerabilities of the free world, but rather revolutionary opportunities that Soviet leaders felt obliged to support. In the imagination of Soviet leaders, the historical processes described in Marx-Leninist theory leading to the worldwide victory of socialism were inevitable. Their job was therefore not to export revolution, but to make room for history to take its course by preventing imperialism from artificially delaying the historical process of revolutionary transformation. This led the Soviets to find themselves devoting massive amounts of resources to places they found strategically inconvenient and politically useless, since it meant that any would-be revolutionary had some kind of legitimate claim on the resources of the socialist motherland. Often this put the Soviet Union at the mercy of its supposed clients. Moscow's worries that Cuban adventurism would create problems in Latin America that it did not want to deal with led the Soviets telling the Bolivian communists not to help Che Guevara, and might have even gone as far as to lead the Soviets to play a more active role in his death. Most significantly, it meant that the Soviet Union often found itself at the mercy of the North Vietnamese leadership, which was determined to prosecute a war that many in Moscow thought it could not win. Nevertheless, Hanoi maneuvered between Moscow and Beijing during the Sino-Soviet split to gain the max amount of aid from each while simultaneously maintaining as much policy autonomy as possible. A large part of Hanoi's leverage was the fact that the North Vietnamese leaders were such devoted communists, and both they and their communist patrons understood their cause as being central to the fate of international communism rather than just Vietnamese nationalism. It was therefore sincere belief in the communist cause, rather than strategic calculation, that led the Soviets and others to see involvement in the Third World not just as an opportunity, but as an obligation. This understanding can help us resolve certain questions arising from the nature of the Cold War geopolitics. First of all, the domino theory, much mocked as the province of paranoid anti-communists, contained a great deal of accuracy. Since communist parties relied so heavily on external help, it made sense the fall of one country to communism would make its neighbors more susceptible to communist insurgency because it would open paths for the supply of men and material and provide strategic depth. In this view, the fact that the rest of Southeast Asia did not become communist after the fall of South Vietnam does not invalidate the theory. It just means the dominoes were stopped in Thailand, not in South Vietnam. This notion of the importance of territorial contiguity to communist insurrection is demonstrated as well in Indonesia, where the desires of the Indonesian communists to start a guerrilla insurgency was countered by Stalin and the Chinese on the simple grounds that Indonesia was an archipelago. If Indonesia had shared a land border with China, it almost certainly would have had a communist guerrilla insurgency. Similarly, this can help us understand the failure of détente. Détente seems to have been doomed ultimately because the two sides had different understandings of what it meant. For the United States, détente seems to have been understood as something like a ceasefire, in which both sides would stop their advances and leave things as they were. But for the Soviets, freezing the world in place was not only impossible, but it was not their choice to make. Who were they to stop history? They could not prevent revolutionary explosions in Angola, Ethiopia, or elsewhere, and they were obliged to support them when they occurred. In sum, the evidence that has become available in the wake of the Cold War helps us to see that Soviet communism was indeed an international phenomenon, not because the Soviet Union was run by a power-hungry clique bent on world domination, but rather because the ideological underpinnings of the revolution required it to be so and remain so, whether or not it ultimately redounded to the advantage of either the Soviets or other communists around the world. Thank you.
John.
Well, first I want to thank the foundation for putting on this conference and I certainly want to thank Mr. Robinson for his very generous introduction. Earl Browder, the leader of the Communist Party of the United States of America from 1930 until 1945, claimed in an article he wrote in 1960 that an article that appeared in the April 1945 issue of Le Cahiers de Communisme constituted the first public declaration of the Cold War. He was particularly sensitive about this matter because if that 1945 article was the first shot in the Cold War, he was the one who took the bullet. As a result of the publication of that article, his colleagues ousted him from the leadership of the CPUSA and expelled him from the party altogether. The background of this, and this fits in with Stalin's National Front policy during World War II and in Eastern Europe for a few years thereafter, is this. After the Nazi-Soviet pact of August 1939, The CPUSA had naturally dropped its Popular Front policy of the 1930s and embarked on a very harsh denunciation of President Roosevelt and his aid and support for those national powers fighting Nazi Germany. They opposed his reelection in 1940 and attacked Roosevelt as a fascist and an imperialist, and took altogether a fierce anti-war stance. Naturally, when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in June of 1941, this policy changed very quickly, and in accordance with directives from the Communist International, the CPUSA adopted a policy of assigning communism, socialism, and the revolution to a very distant future, of emphasizing that the only issue that mattered was one of the broadest possible coalition to fight Nazi Germany, and all-out support for President Roosevelt and his policies. All of that was similar to the stance taken by communist parties all over the world. No really surprises there. But several things happened in 1943 and 44 that changed things. The constant contact between American communists and Moscow had really ended with the start of the war. In the 1920s and 30s, dozens of American communists went to the Soviet Union every year to attend Comintern schools, to undertake internships on Comintern staff, to become Comintern officials for a few years. And at the same time, the Comintern sent senior agents over to the US to assist and guide the American Party. All of that really ended with war in 1939 because such travel became, as a practical matter, impossible. Further, the constant exchange of written material, orders, comments, reports, all that kind of thing also ended because of wartime censorship on what was sent to and from the Soviet Union. That left Earl Browder on his own in many ways and making his own decisions and interpreting things. Well, after the Tehran conference between Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, he decided that he understood far better than the Comintern did really what Stalin had in mind and what future history would bring. He decided that Tehran indicated that Britain and the United States had permanently accepted the USSR as a major figure in the war and in world history, and that the constant conflict between the West and the Soviet Union would really be brought to an end, and the post-war world would see a continuation of the wartime Grand Alliance, and that Eastern Europe would not be rebuilt on a Soviet basis, but on a basis of a broad national front, of the continuation of bourgeois democratic standards, and without the imposition of really a Soviet regime. This was in accordance with official announced Soviet policy. The Soviets signed every declaration that came along since from the Atlantic Charter onward, promising internal democracy for the nations of Eastern Europe after the war. But Browder's innovations in the National Front policy were to project that infinitely into the future. He also then reinterpreted the position of communists in American society. The traditional stance had been that the Communist Party was the sole legitimate representative of the working class, and both the Democrats and Republicans were representative of different wings of the bourgeoisie. He reinterpreted that to a stance which was totally un-Marxist, really, which were that both of those two great parties were coalitions, regional coalitions, local coalitions, coalitions of special interest. and that each represented broad segments of American society, and that the only way for communists to play a useful role in American society was to become part of one of those coalitions. And in accordance with that, in 1944, first the Young Communist League was dissolved, the American Young Communist League, and renamed the American Youth for Democracy, with a platform that did not even mention revolution or socialism. Then, at a special convention in 1944, the Communist Party itself dissolved and reorganized itself as a Communist Political Association, and really declared that it was going to take its role in American politics through one of the broad national parties, the Democratic Party in this case, and play the role of being a hard left advocacy group within the broad liberal left coalition. Well, the Comintern did hear of his reforms and sent him a warning in a coded telegram that this was really going a bit far and he should reconsider. Well, he didn't even tell his colleagues that the Comintern had warned him. He told them that Moscow had agreed to his reforms. Well, if his reforms actually had continued over time, it really would, I suspect, have integrated the communist movement so deeply into mainstream politics, they would have lost their ability to act on Moscow's orders. Well, Moscow didn't really care for that. And in the spring of 1945, there appeared this article, ostensibly authored by Jacques Duclos in Cahiers de Communisme, that denounced browderism in the harshest possible terms, that said that his assumption that the Tehran Agreement represented a declaration of post-war class peace and the end of the class struggle was totally un-Marxist and totally unacceptable. Well, his colleagues in the United States, once this article was translated, realized this was probably a message from Moscow, delivered indirectly. So in quick order, he was stripped of his powers as head of the Communist Political Association. An emergency convention was held, and the Communist Party of the United States reconstituted. And then within a year, he, Browder himself, was expelled from the party. Well, the Duclos article indeed was a message from Moscow. In the mid-1990s, Harvey Clare, whom you'll hear from tomorrow, and I discovered the original in a Moscow archive in Russian. That was then translated into French and sent to France for Jacques Duclos to have it published under his name. The only thing the French did with the article was someone went through the translation and changed some things in more idiomatic French. And they added a rather unconvincing paragraph at the front of the article about why Jacques Duclos was taking an interest in the American Communist Party. And then added a few paragraphs at the end saying, of course, we in the French Party are doing, nothing we're doing in any way resembles browderism. Well, what happened there is really, in some ways, a parallel to what happened to Stalin's National Front policy. Because with the reconstitution of the American Party, Moscow once again had a vehicle for use if it needed it, and it did as the Cold War developed after the end of the war. And the Communist Party then pulled its supporters and allies out of the broad liberal left coalition and organized the Progressive Party in 1948 behind Henry Wallace as an attack on President Truman's Cold War policies. If I had another 10 minutes, I would go on about some of the events in Eastern Europe that paralleled some of this, but I don't have another 10 minutes, so I'll stop at this point.
John Haynes, that was a dirty trick. To be brilliant for 10 minutes and then say, well, Mark Kramer.
Good. Because the foundation has a sophisticated system for warning people about time, which I was unaware of until I sat up here, I will get immediately into my remarks. And I published an article in the Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta, which is, Vladimir Karamurza mentioned it earlier today. It's one of the very few outlets for independent views in Russia still left during the Putin era. And in that article, I pointed out that the real 75th anniversary had come in 2014, not in 2016, because Soviet troops were involved from the very beginning, 1939 to 1941, in the Second World War. It's just that they happened during that period to be aligned with Nazi Germany. During that time, some of the worst atrocities in Soviet operations in Eastern Europe occurred, some of which have been mentioned in passing earlier today. But that period, it also included a bloody and quite poorly executed war against Finland and operations all through the swath of Eastern Europe that had been divided up with Nazi Germany, portions of what became the Soviet Union in the immediate aftermath of the war, including the 3 Baltic republics, but also portions of Romania that became the Republic of Moldova, and then portions of Eastern Poland, which were large portions of Eastern Poland that were incorporated into Belarus and Ukraine. That was already in place in that period from 1939 to June of 1941. So the Soviet Union was deeply involved in the Second World War from the beginning. Then in the closing year of the war with the massive Soviet counteroffensives against German troops, Soviet forces ended up occupying the large majority of Eastern Europe. Some portions of the Balkans were not included, but almost all of Eastern Europe did fall under Soviet occupation. Many of those troops remained in place until 1991. So the Soviet bloc, as it became known in Eastern Europe, was ostensibly an alliance. The Soviet Union was formally allied with the East European countries, but oddly enough, the most common Soviet military operations after 1945 occurred against its own allies. So it was if you wanted to avoid falling victim to Soviet aggression, the best thing was not to be a member of the Soviet bloc. For example, in the 1948, after Stalin expelled Yugoslavia from the bloc, initially he clearly did that in the expectation that the Yugoslav regime could be brought down either through covert operations or through political pressure, economic coercion. But then from 1951 to 1953, Stalin undertook and also forced all of the East European countries surrounding Yugoslavia to undertake a crash military buildup that seems to have been intended to undertake a full-scale invasion of Yugoslavia to bring it back into the Soviet fold. That didn't occur. I would, again, looking at the preparations that were being made, the huge escalation of the Soviet military buildup, that
it didn't occur mostly because Stalin died. When he died, it came to an abrupt end, and from that point on, Yugoslavia became a country that had actually left the Soviet bloc. And that was also later the case with a couple of other countries. China had been, after communists came to power in China in 1949, China had been very much part of the Soviet bloc, even though it was in Asia, but there was a Sino-Soviet alliance that was one of the closest. Mao, despite having fancied himself also a world communist leader, nonetheless was willing to subordinate himself to Stalin during that time. After Stalin died again, Mao became increasingly uneasy about doing that, and eventually led to the full-scale rupture between the Soviet Union and China at the end of the 1960s, end of the 1950s. But there too, a country that had been part of the Soviet bloc eventually did break away. And then also subsequently, Albania, in 1961, it ceased taking part in any activities of the different institutions of the Soviet bloc, and then in 1968 formally left the Warsaw Pact, of which it had been a member. So it is true that the Soviet bloc was not strictly a Hotel California. If you remember the Eagles song from the late 1970s with the line, "You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave." There were, in fact, a few countries that did leave, and in that sense, it was not quite the prison that was depicted in that song. But still, there were other attempts, particularly in Hungary in 1956, that ended much less successfully, that were crushed by Soviet military intervention. So let me turn then to look at instances in which Soviet troops were used in Eastern Europe to preserve orthodox communist regimes. The first instance occurred almost just a few months after Stalin died in June 1953. There was a large-scale uprising in East Germany, not just East Berlin as it's often described. It was more than 600 cities in East Germany in which there were mass demonstrations against the communist regime, and the tone of it almost from the beginning became profoundly anti-Soviet as well as anti-communist. Soviet troops were deployed in very large numbers already at that point in East Germany, and about 400,000 Soviet troops. They were, because the East German regime proved wholly incapable of dealing with the uprising, was on the verge of collapse, so Soviet troops intervened to prevent that. It was a large, very large deployment. There were 19 divisions deployed to put down the uprising. But it was done with relatively little bloodshed considering the scale of the uprising. It was done with only about 40 or so casualties, which, again, bearing in mind that they had been at war with each other and in ferocious terms only 8 years earlier, is a surprisingly small number of casualties. Much larger, though, was in Hungary in 1956. Congressman Ross mentioned this in passing, is the revolution that occurred in Hungary starting on the 23rd of October and then continuing until massive Soviet intervention on the 4th of November, 3 days of fighting. So yesterday, as he mentioned, was the anniversary in which the Hungarian Revolution had come to an end through bloodshed with the intervention of Soviet troops. There were about 2,500 Hungarians killed during that time, which, considering how brief the period of fighting was, is a very large number. It was a very bloody counterinsurgency number. There were also about 760 Soviet troops killed, which will give you a sense of the intensity of the resistance on the part of the Hungarian revolutionary. So that was it. That was a case in which the Hotel California policy was strictly enforced. Then in 1968, during the Prague Spring, a sweeping program of liberalization in Czechoslovakia, a very far-reaching program. It was led by communists, but ones who actually thought that Communist Party should be popular and not simply rest on coercion. That the Prague Spring lasted for 8 months, but was brought to a crushing end in August 1968 by a Soviet invasion, plus the participation of other Warsaw Pact countries, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Poland. There was also ostensibly an East German unit that took part, although it didn't actually take part because the intervention of Gomulka, the Polish leader, and then some of the Czechoslovak, pro-Soviet Czechoslovak leaders indicated that the introduction of East German troops combat troops onto Czechoslovak soil would be a grave mistake in light of memories from the war. So they didn't actually take part, but the East German regime until 1989 insisted that they had. So it's again a case in which a regime was boasting about an atrocity that it didn't actually carry out. In 1980 and 81, during the Solidarność period in Poland, Soviet troops were used repeatedly to undertake coercive diplomacy vis-a-vis Poland, but ultimately that was resolved through the imposition of martial law. So after 1968, there were no further direct instances of the use of Soviet forces in Eastern Europe, but indirectly they were present during every domestic crisis that both those in the regime and those who were challenging the regime were aware that there was the possibility of a repeat of 1953, 56, or 68. And that continued to be the case even in 1989. And we all know that once people on the ground came to realize that there wasn't going to be that intervention, those regimes collapsed. And that would have happened 40 years earlier had there not been the Soviet military presence and the willingness to use it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Emanuelis Zingeris.
Yes, sir. If you allow me, I would like to be a little bit liberated from darkness and go to the podium. Okay, thank you.
That was not a figurative comment about darkness. It is dark up here. So.
No. That was, be sure, that was not academic remark. So I'm sorry, I have my 20 pages here in good English, but if I will choose my English, that will be more Eastern European English, and I will say what I think, it probably will be better for all of you. And I would like to say here in this incredible important place, on a incredible important occasion, first of all, thank you to Marion, and thank you for assembling us, and we hope to see the museum, and probably in museum you will establish the other voice of America towards captive nation who are still captive. And we will have next time meeting in your museum, Marion. But the realities belong to my family was very strange, actually. I am a second Holocaust generation. My mother was captive in Nazi concentration camp. I spent my academic life being in archives, trying to study what happened with Yiddish culture, huge Yiddish cultural heritage in pre-war time, in our Weimar time. It was pre-war time when we accepted to be successful. It was successful stories, ladies and gentlemen, from 1918 until 1940. Successful stories for example, not only for Czech Republic Czechoslovakia established in 1918, but for 5 countries, Finland, Poland, Baltic states, who say goodbye to communist Bolshevik Russia and become independent, observing and become members of League of Nations in Geneva, and observing when Ukraine not become a member of League of Nations, and Georgia not become a member of League of Nations and was become captive by Bolsheviks after 2 years of independence. For us, for me, pre-war time was our authentic reality. And we were, during the captive time, answering to your question, how we feel captive. So we feel captive every day, searching our blood, that we are not becoming Soviets. That was the situation in the Baltic countries. Well, we have overbooked with pre-war successful memories about successful states, our homes not destroyed by Soviets or by Nazis, Christmas trees. Can you imagine? From 65 to 77, being in the middle school, every 23rd of December, 22nd of December, girls try to have a tree. Every time we have visiting at the, it was sport teacher with positive Olympic symbols, GDR inscription, coming to my middle school in Kaunas, saying, kids, we know that you are good in ethics and you will not do this tree before 24. And your moral will be clear. So, everyone tried to keep the tree behind in hidden places in school, but it was done usually every time on 23rd of December. So in this case, the Soviet realities were never ever accepted like our realities in the Baltic, trying to cope with the memories of the neighborhood, with the partisans in the woods who fight with the weapons against Soviet regime, actually, if you know, until 65. So being inside of this hell of Soviet Union, where everything was upside down, religion was anti-moral, progress was anti-progress, for us was extremely important to think that one day we will become out of this Kafkanian Soviet reality. So in 1888, our movements was actually related to the pre-war stories. And the speed of our integration to European Union and NATO was based on our pre-war successful statehoods. And trying to understand our Ukrainian friends, Georgia, now looking to them, how they try to become members of our European Union and NATO community, with huge, huge support from our side. And actually understanding that these 2 years of their independence, 80-20, probably it will be for you too romantic what I will say now, was the try who were very basic for them. But they have not 22 years, and we have our 22 years of freedom. And that gives for us speed of European Union and NATO integration in the 90s. Actually, and when our academic, not communist movements, academic led by academicians, professors, were started in 88, it was related deeply to Middle European experience of Charta, of Polish Solidarność. And if you will ask me how we cope with the fact that Vilnius was under Polish rule during 20 years of First and Second World War, I will tell you that it was compensated by our anti-communist solidarity, and our relations to Poland was based on brotherhood with Polish Solidarność. Don't forget that in Kaunas region we have Polish TV, we have direct translations. Polish guys brought to us Geremek, Adam Michnik, other friends, literature. We were in great communication with Poland. And in this case, I think the Soviet Russians make mistake thinking that our academicians will be very, very weak opponents. Mr. Landsbergis, who became 85 years just few days ago, he was a pianist, but he was a chess player. We have experience not only of ironizing Soviet Union, but we have experience thinking how quickly to use their opportunity to say goodbye during their weakness. But we have one obstacle. Obstacle was our Russian democratic friends. My young friend Boris Nemtsov, now late, and President Yeltsin. We received massive support from Russian Democrats. And on 28th of July, we make our agreement with Russia. It was agreement including the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, recognition of illegal occupation of the Baltic country by Mr. Yeltsin. But one day later, the Soviet troops, 29, attacked our border officers in Lithuania, and they killed our guard. So between Soviet Russia and Russian Democrats, even looking to our Russian friends here in the room, I would like to say, I remember a huge demonstration for the Baltic independence on Manezhnaya in Moscow, the freedom for Lithuania. And Sergei Kovalyov and other friends telling to me, let's build Emanuel democracy together. And my answer was, okay, guys, let's build democracy separately. Well, it was feeling that the Yeltsin declared Communist Party forbidden, and we have an idea that they will not rebuild the party structure. Don't forget that 17 months, you can imagine, from 11th of March to 19th of August, coup in Moscow, we declare independence. You can imagine the pressure we suffer in the Baltic for 17 months, trying to knock on every door, being in Iceland, Copenhagen, asking them to recognize us, not being recognized from their mercy, from Moscow mercy, but being recognized from our Western friends. And 5 countries, Iceland, Denmark, Slovenia, Russian Federation actually, Croatia did it, and they recognized our independence, the Baltic independence. Of course, it was done mostly after Russian attacks against TV tower in Vilnius, and the bloodshed and tower, when thousands of people came to defend the parliament. After the story, what I said to you, and probably somebody can tell us how we feel now. We feel now absolutely, purely being on Checkpoint Charlie, but from Western side in Checkpoint Charlie, being the last one in the West, and trying to have Western presence, in massive Western presence, NATO presence. Today is a day of Lithuanian army. We have all military officers. Today we celebrated in our building, who have 100-year building of Lithuanian embassy is 100-year-old. And we established in center of Vilnius, huge plaza in the name of Sumner Welles, which huge plate in the Cooper full declaration, including that United States will never ever recognize Baltic states who become democratic, Sumner Welles declaration. And I remember very well that in Kaunas pre-war time, we have W. Wilson, W on the walls, remembering the Wilson declaration. So our next steps will be to make a plaza of memory for President Wilson in Vilnius, and be sure you will visit those remarkable places, and we will say to you, thank you so much for having clear politics against not recognition of captive nations. And Actually, those politics should be now directed to Ukraine. Thank you.